Hello everyone, this is Vinnie Baines, BC Chapter President of the Canadian Association of Critical Care Nurses. We are back with another installment of Handshake BC, ICU nursing across the province. As you may know, back in May 9th, we had a conference here in Vancouver. So our next speaker is actually me. I'm going to be telling you about the launch of the Critical Care Outreach Team for St. Paul's Hospital. So without further ado, here we go.
We're working on at St. Paul's Hospital. So St. Paul's is a hospital in the middle of Vancouver, 540-ish size patient beds, size-wise. So it's a good size. It's not the biggest ICU in the world, but it's not the smallest either. And we do a lot of really amazing, innovative work there. We have been working for the last couple of years to launch what's called a Critical Care Outreach Team. And we spent a good chunk of time trying to figure out how we were going to build this Critical Care Outreach Team. Now is the work that we've done. We just launched. February 11th was our launch day. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we did, why we thought we needed this thing, what we thought we needed to build, and how we're doing so far. When we started to look at our patient data, so we have, you have this really massive ICU database where a lot of the ICUs still pour information in. St. Paul's is one of those places. We collect information on every single patient that walks through our doors. And when you have the lovely opportunity of diving into the work that our informatics team does, that's 900 variables per patient. And that's 790 patients per year for St. Paul's. So there's a lot of really rich information in there. And so that's what we looked at when we looked at our patient data. And we can kind of compare populations. And what we compared was, okay, let's take a look at the patients that come to us directly from the ED, the emergency department, versus the patients that come to us from the wards. How are they the same and how are they different? Theoretically, you think the person who comes to you directly from ED is sicker, so they should do worse. And the person that comes to us from the ward, they didn't show up as sick, so they shouldn't be as sick. And that's not entirely the case. So our ED to ICU population is about 300 patients. It's a little over a third, but our ward to ICU patients is a little under a third. That's about 200 patients a year. And animations are not going to work. Oh, there we go. And the difference is, when do they get to us? So patients that come to us from the emergency department, they get usually on average to us within 6 hours, which, yay. But the patients who come to us from the ward, on average, it varies, but on average, they get to us on day 10. ICU length of stay. So when they're in the ICU, their actual average length of stay is not that different. The ED to ICU is 6 days, the ward to ICU is 7 days. It's not that different. But the real difference starts to look at when you look at total hospital length of stay. So the patients that come to us directly from the emerge within 6 hours, they usually go home within about just over 2 weeks. But the patients that come to us from the floor, they go home in like 35 days. So they're here much longer than our ED to ICU patients. And that has an impact on their well-being. Every day you spend in hospital is a day that you're losing your abilities, and when you go home, you have less chance of going home to being able to do everything you could do. But and of course, it has an impact on hospital capacity. The other big difference is the mortality rate. So the ICU mortality rate, chances of dying in the ICU, is really slightly different. You're slightly higher, more likely to die if you came to us from the ward, so that's 18% versus 15%. The real difference is hospital mortality. So you may not die in the ICU, but your chances of dying in hospital, the difference is 20% versus 30%. And that is pretty significant. That raises questions. That doesn't make sense to any of us. And I think that this is a story that many hospitals and many people kind of experience. And it's been in the literature for a while. And when people started exploring this problem, the thing was, what is happening in the 10 days before you got to ICU? Is there something we can do there to make a difference? Thankfully, places like Australia and the UK and places in Canada as well have explored that and come up with strategies on what to do. And a rapid response system, or a critical care outreach team, as we call them in BC, is one of those things. The other bit of data, like this is our ICU patient data, but the other bit of data that we looked at was our cardiac arrest rates. So, because what rapid response teams, the literature out there says, is you can reduce your cardiac arrest rate, in-hospital cardiac arrest rates. And the literature is a wonderful place to dive into, but they don't have standardized measures for anything. So trying to figure out how your hospital compares to other hospitals based on what's reported in the literature, is really complicated. So I'm going to do my best to walk you through what I understand it to be after I've kind of dug around. So at St. Paul's, we have just over 200, 300 arrests per year. Those are all Code Blue events. And critical care outreach teams, that work happens outside of the ICU. It's what happens before you get to us. So where they have an impact on cardiac arrest rates is outside the hospital. So let's take the chunk of Code Blues that happen in critical care and say we're not going to worry about those. So that means that's 240 Code Blues that happen in non-critical care areas at St. Paul's, on average. So if you look at those, Code Blues is a smorgasbord of things. It's everything from somebody accidentally hit the button because they were cleaning the wall to somebody's doing a full-on arrest. So it's a messy thing to measure. So let's break those up into whether we did CPR or not, because that's something we can kind of easily measure, but also potentially where we can make that difference. So at St. Paul's, we have about 60 codes where we're actually doing CPR per year, and the rest of them are all those other types of codes where they might be unstable or stable or a false alarm. So that works out to just over a code a week that we're doing CPR in a non-critical area in our hospital. How does that compare with other places? It's tricky to kind of figure out because other hospitals, some of them aren't cardiac centers like St. Paul's are. Some of them have different patient populations. They're bigger, they're smaller. So how do you figure out, how do you compare? So what you can do to sort of correct for size is do it by 1,000 patient admissions. So all Code Blue events that happen in the whole hospital, that's about 22 Code Blues per 1,000 patient admissions. Sounds like a really big number. Code Blues that in non-critical care areas, that's about 13 or 14 per 1,000 patient admissions. Code Blues that required CPR, that's about 3.34 per 1,000 patient admissions. So what does that mean? Some of the literature out there say that you can reduce cardiac arrest rates, in-hospital cardiac arrest rates in non-critical areas to 1.5 or less. So based on that, we probably can cut our cardiac arrest rate in half if we implement the same strategies that other hospitals have tried. So that's kind of the impetus for why we opted to go this route. And this is old literature. This has been around since I think the 1980s or 90s. When we looked at cardiac arrest in hospital, and we looked at the 8 to 24 hours prior to them getting a cardiac arrest, most of the time, patients had documented signs of clinical deterioration. So somebody actually wrote down vital signs and documented that this patient was deteriorating for up to 24 hours in advance for most of those events, which means that means we have to kind of shift our way of thinking that in-hospital cardiac arrests are not a given. They're not a must-have. There's something that potentially are quite preventable. When they looked into why cardiac arrests were happening, like what happened in the 8 to 24 hours, the things that were happening that led on to a full-on cardiac arrest were different types of failures. And the first one is failure to recognize. So you and I, as critical care people, we are very good at picking up on those early signs of clinical deterioration. We put the whole picture together. We can put the whole set of vital signs, the change in behavior, and we can say, oh, this is clinical deterioration, and we know what to do next. But if you work on a ward where you very rarely see clinical deterioration, Code Blues happen once or twice a year, and probably not on your shift, you don't know those early clinical warning signs. So you miss those signs and you miss the opportunity to act early. Sometimes people actually recognize, there's something going on that I need to be worried about, but for whatever reason, the communication between the members of the team to do something about that kind of broke down. And, early days with our critical care outreach team, a closed unit in ICU is a wonderful place because our doctor's right there and it's very easy to talk. On the ward, you have many doctors taking care of the same patients. They're never in the same place, and you never even know if you've got the right phone number. So the complexity of trying to communicate information between team members is a whole lot harder. So it's much easier to see why, there are failures of communication happening. And then sometimes people see that something's going wrong. They got a hold of the right people, and they told them what was going on, and people had a failure to intervene. And part of that is a little bit of uncertainty about how to intervene. ICU nurses throwing 4 liters at a person, not a big deal. We do it all the time. And when we see it, we know this person's going to need a couple liters to turn them around. But on the floors, that's not how they don't act that quickly. They have uncertainty about doing those interventions that quickly. And so they tend to take a wait and see approach. And that's where you get, another potential opportunity that gets missed. So this was a good idea. We had good evidence that we needed to do it, and now we had to figure out what we were going to do. And St. Paul's Hospital, I'll tell you a little bit of history, is we actually had a critical care outreach team back in 2007, 2008. It was the first critical care outreach team in BC at the time, but for many reasons, it didn't quite take. I think the literature was different back then. We had an idea of what to do, but we don't have the mountain of evidence that we do now. And in the interim, what had happened was the critical care outreach team remained a nurse-led team. We never got physician funding for it. So it dissolved without having the full team. And then it got taken over by another role, with the clinical resource nurse. So what they did is they closed down the critical care outreach team, and from about 2009 onward, they had what's called a clinical resource nurse. That team evolved. They had a mandate of mentorship, of nurse mentorship, like in the moment, 24/7 nurse mentorship. And in many ways, the role of the CRN kind of overlapped with the CCOT team used to do, but it also evolved over that time to be something different. And so we had a team of people who were doing a lot of the things that our outreach team, we were proposing our outreach team was going to do, but they weren't doing exactly the same things the same way. And they had a lot of opinions about how best are we going to change patient outcomes, and what do we need to do. So we had those visions kind of had to explore. So there's a lot of opinions that our organizations deal with. Thankfully, from 2008 to 2018, there has been a mountain of research about what critical care outreach teams do, what they need to do right in order to succeed, and what goes wrong when they fail. And so one of the things that we did as our team is we kind of looked at what happened in 2008, and we looked at, okay, so why did this team, what are the different factors that impacted its failure? And what are the things that we were doing wrong that we could have done differently? So we took a lot, a little bit of soul searching and comparing that with the literature. Thankfully, we also had some great resources nearby to pull from. So VGH had a critical care outreach team that had been running and had proven that they could change patient outcomes for the past 10 years, I think 10 years. So we had them to go to, and I was kind of a ringer. I used to work at VGH, and that's one of the jobs I did. So we had that data and that skill set and that resource to tap on a shoulder. But in the time that was going on, Vancouver Island has actually launched a critical care outreach service as well. And they did it based on the context that they have in their hospital. So they have slightly different strategies, but there were also a wealth of information that we could steal ideas from and figure out how we're going to build this thing. And Surrey Memorial Hospital also has an outreach team. It's not exactly the outreach team that VGH has, but it's not exactly the CRN model that we had. And so we could pick their brains about finding out, how are they different and what do they do and what can we do better. So that was awesome. And then I'm going to tell you why I'm super jealous of Ontario. I mean, I'm not jealous of the government, but I am jealous of the critical care services of Ontario. So Ontario is a big province. It's bigger than us. They have, and over the decade that they've been doing critical care outreach teams, they have a mandate from the government that says if you have more than 22 critical care beds, you get funding for an outreach team, full funding. It's yours. You just need to have 22 critical care beds, not just ICU beds, so ICU, CCU, OR, just 22. And so you'll see in the last 10 years when they build hospitals in Ontario, they make sure they have 22 beds. Yeah, and this is the work that Ontario has done over the past 10 years to lobby the government to say, okay, we've proven that this works, we've proven that we've made a difference in patient outcomes. Now you've got to help fund it for the rest of the hospitals. So that's where they're at. Not only that, they get together, all the critical care outreach teams, quarterly to talk about what goes right, what goes wrong, what can you do better. And one of the things that came out of their quarterly meetings over the past decade is when they had gotten together and they said, you know what, we got great critical care nurses on this team. We got great people working together. They know their clinical stuff inside out and backwards. They know what they're doing. They know what to do when they see trouble. Where they tend to fall down, where we tend to struggle with, is those softer skills about, you know, why we have a critical care outreach team, what matters, and how we, and what are all those other things that get bundled into what happens when you go to a floor. So they put together a learning module, an online learning module that gives you an overview of the whole purpose behind a critical care outreach team, what it's intended to do. They have conflict resolution, communication, ethics, because we get involved with end of life and goals of care discussions. So having a little bit of ethical skill set is handy, and crisis resource management, which is a method of enhancing communication between teams. Because a lot of why patients fail usually falls down to, you know, the communication between the teams. We're not all on the same page about what needs to happen next. And so those were the skills that they put together for us. And they released it as an online learning module, which was free to use, so we stole it. It's a 2-hour learning module. So you feel free to Google it if you're ever interested. It's actually pretty well put together. It's not exactly what we need to do for BC. They have slightly different mandates. They call things slightly different things over there. So we had to gave our team the primer of this module, but we also built in a fairly robust education program to go with it, to adapt what they do to what we want to do. And so this is where we started. This is our critical care outreach team. So the way we have it set up in our hospital, based on their size and our funding and what the logistics were possible, is we have our critical care outreach team. We now have, we had 30 nurses for our heartbeat, and then somebody decided to go to PACU, and somebody else got into the master's program, and now we're at 28. But we have ICU nurses that have at least 2 or more years of clinical experience. But also, they really wanted to be part of the outreach team. So the intent of doing this work, that passion needed to be there, and they were recognized as being really good communicators. So the ones that we tap on the shoulder to mentor new colleagues, those are the ones that we wanted to put onto our outreach team. And I have to say, I mean, they ran the team. We put together everything we could, but they ran the team, and they faced every problem and issue and ridiculous things head on. They solved problems before I even knew about it. Like on Friday, something would go on, and on Monday they had already solved it, and they just let me know about it. So hats off to them. We wanted to prove that they have really strong clinical skills. So the CACCN has the standards for critical care nursing. We use that to build our ICU competency tool. And that actually, those standards are the same thing that they use for the CNA certification exam. So if you have your CNA certification, tick, you're definitely a member of our team. But also if you're potentially eligible to write that exam, so 4,000 hours of experience, and you show that you are a very good clinician, based on our competency tool, those were the kind of the criteria that we were looking for. On our hospital, we weren't able to have a dedicated RT to come with us like BGH does, but we have ward RTs who are float throughout the hospital, and we were able to collaborate with them. So the ward RT, I think the most exciting thing is they got to have a cell phone rather than a pager because they were on the CCOT team. So the ward RTs, they share their duties. They do ward RT stuff, but then they also connect with the CCOT team throughout the day to say, what do you know, what's going on, can you come see this patient, and we share the load that way. And I have to say the ward RTs are instrumental in not only teaching the whole hospital how to use our critical care outreach team, but they're actually instrumental in activating patients. I can tell you what happened on our very first CCOT call. Very first CCOT call, day one, I was sitting in the office going, okay, is everything working okay? And the RT came down for our 8 o'clock check-in, and he says, there's a patient on the 7th floor. I'm going to go, they've been working on him all night. I'm going to go up there and tell him to call you. And he goes up to the 7th floor, and he says, yeah, this would be a good call for CCOT. Here's the number. Why don't you call them? So our very first CCOT call got activated technically by a nurse, but really it was our RT that brought in that business. So they're really good at saying, because they often get called for the first thing, and then they're really good at saying, this is actually a CCOT patient. You can call us for that. So it's really handy to have them there. And then we have intensivists. We have a really dedicated team of intensivists who are just thrilled that they get to be part of the team officially this time. So we're all kind of learning how we're doing it. It's still early days, so they all kind of have their own flavor of doing CCOT. I think Shirley can tell more about that. But they do check in, they follow up on all our patients as well, and they're so responsive. The outcomes. What is CCOT trying to achieve? Well, there's some really hard patient outcomes that we want to look at. We want to take a look at how many cardiac arrests are happening in our hospital and non-critical care areas. And we want to change that from more than 1 a week to less than 2 a month. That's kind of where we want to go with it. And it's really funny, when we looked at why CCOT thought they were failing the first time around, is they looked at total code blue events. So they looked at how often the code blue pager went off, not how often you were doing CPR. And those initial days, the code blue pager went off more often after CCOT was launched. But that's because you go up there and you say, this is sick enough, this is how you push the code button. So you actually do expect the code blue rate to go up. As long as the CPR rate goes down, that's what we're looking for. So unfortunately, in those early days, because we didn't know what to measure, they thought they were failing when they really might not have been. We want to take a look at our ICU, like our ward to ICU patients, and we want to take a look at their whole hospital stay. Do they actually get discharged earlier than they did before? Like, are we actually making those difference in patient outcomes? And we want to look at their hospital mortality, not the ICU mortality, because we know there's not a huge difference. We want to look at what's happening in the hospital. Now, all of that data is going to come out of the ICU database, and data flows slowly into the ICU database, and it takes a time to get to us. So it's going to be a year before we know that we're making it, shifting those patient outcomes. And it's probably going to take a year of CCOT before you really start to see a significant difference in patient outcomes. So we're looking at 2 years of waiting for those numbers. How do we know if we're doing the right thing in the interim? And what some people say is target outcomes are great, but they're often the last thing that you measure, like the last bit of data you get. But if you know what the right keys to success are, what the right processes that need to be in place, if you measure those process outcomes, you can predict that you're going to achieve your target outcomes. So pay attention to those process measures. And so that's what we've set up ourselves to do. So what do we need to do right, and why did we fail last time? And it turns out when you look at the literature and you look at the experience of other outreach teams out there, it's all about the calls. You need to be called early enough and often enough. And if you're not called early enough or often enough, you're not going to be able to be there in order to change a patient trajectory. So what the literature says is you need to get at least 50 calls per 1,000 patient admissions. For a hospital the size of St. Paul's, that's 17 or more calls per week of pick up the phone or RT nudge or drive by, oh, that person looks sick. Whatever it takes to initiate that call, it's about making sure you get enough call volume. We want to be known for being fast and reliable. I'm just trying to circle back with all the different programs to say how we're doing, and they're almost shocked at how fast and reliable we are. Sometimes they're thinking, oh, you're here already? Like, I just got off the phone with you. But that's what we're aiming for, to be at the bedside within 15 minutes or less. And what the literature says, it really is all about the communication, because the person is phoning you from the other end. They're scared and they're not sure if they're going to be doing the right thing, and they need to have, they're extra sensitive to how you interact with them. So, and if one negative call impacts the next time they're going to call you, they're going to delay calling you the next time, and that has an impact on patient outcomes. So communication is a huge key to success. And then the other part is, are we being called early enough? We had a conversation with one of our CCOT nurses the other day. Like the first few weeks, it was a lot of, this is how you push the code button. This is sick enough. You don't have to wait for the heart to stop. And we had a lot of, quick transfers to the ICU so they can have an arrest there. Those events are great. It's much safer to have an arrest in the ICU versus on the ward, but they probably don't change patient outcomes as much as if you go to the floor where the Mu scores are relatively low, the patients are relatively stable, and they just need a few tweaks here and there. Those calls are kind of boring, but they probably have the bigger impact on patient outcomes. So being called early enough. This is one of the slides from our education day. We really wanted to make sure that we nailed we nailed how we communicated with nurses and anybody who would be talking to us. And so this is the picture that we gave them. Is that often, if they're on the phone with you, they're probably handling something in front of them that they don't know that they can handle. So they're scared. And one of the first things you lose when you're scared and uncertain is the ability to communicate, but also the ability to interpret what communication is happening to you. So we wanted to make sure that the communication that we had was very strategic. So it seems really redundant and like a little bit kindergartnerish, but it's really quite important. So the first thing you say when you pick up the phone is thank you for contacting CCOT. Reassure them that it's the right thing to do to call us. Call us first, and then we'll figure it from there. Don't worry about not activating. The other part that we learned from the literature is that if we're fast and reliable, and an MRP may or may not be fast and reliable, what happens is when you got a busy shift, who are you going to call? The one that's going to be there in 5 minutes. And so the possibility, what other teams experience, is that if we're fast, that they start bypassing the MRP and contacting CCOT in lieu of, which doesn't help the team take care of their patients, but it also means that everything gets directed to CCOT team, and we're doing more than what we're intending to do. We're supposed to be the safety net. We're not supposed to be the care provider of the service. So we want to make sure that whenever they're contacting us, if they're sick enough to call CCOT, they're sick enough to make sure the MRP is also involved. So you wanted to tie that into our communication strategies. Tell them when you're going to be there, because that goes a long way of reassuring somebody, oh, you're going to be here in 5 minutes, or you're going to be here in 10 minutes, or you're going to be here in 15 minutes. It goes a long way of helping people calm down and be able to think through the problems in front of them. Our CCOT team, they'll do a very thorough assessment, and they'll find out what's going on with the patient. But at the end of all of that, it's great that we fill out a great piece of document that people go to, but have that face-to-face communication with the most responsible nurse before leaving, and let them know, okay, this is what I saw, this is what I suggest, this is what you need to watch out for, and then reassure them, if anything changes, call me back. So before you sign off, what you're planning to do, I'm going to follow up in, I'm going to sign this person off. Just be clear about whether this patient's on or off the CCOT list. And then call us back if you're worried. If anything changes, don't hesitate to call us back. So those are the things that we asked all of our CCOT team to do. And the reason why we picked those things is because those things really seem to matter when it comes to patient outcomes. And you wouldn't think so. You would think it's all clinical, but no, it's all talking. So process measures. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we're active, what triggers we're giving the staff to activate. What the literature says is one of the most common early warning signs of clinical deterioration is deterioration in your respiratory status. So of course, those things are called criteria. And so those are things that the staff can use to trigger us. So a threatened airway, increasing oxygen saturation, increasing oxygen needs, heart rate, respiratory rate fast or slow, cardiovascular, low blood pressure, high blood pressure, low, things that are not normal. Changes in LOC is another early warning sign. Changes in urine output, of course, when I went up to nephrology, they laughed at me at that one, but and that's historically what our CCOT call criteria used to be, is those physiological measures to help people trigger. And what they were finding was we're still missing people. There are still times where we're not being triggered. So what else can we add to our CCOT call criteria? And so the thing that they added was, you just have to be worried about something. You don't have to be able to put your finger on it, you just have to be worried. And that became the most common and effective call criteria out of all of them, is I'm worried about something. In our data, I'll show you in a bit, it turns out to be, when we looked at why people call us, it's a smorgasbord of things. It's a whole bunch of different things, but they were all pretty good reasons to activate us. And what they were finding was that what UK and Australia were finding was, we're being activated a lot, but there's still a bucket of patients where people are missing that opportunity to activate us early enough. And so what they came, and our call criteria is all single physiological measures, but what they came up with is that, if we look at all of those vital signs together and give people a score, give people a tool to screen those vital signs to trigger clinical deterioration and calling us, that's what they came up with. So it's called the Modified Early Warning Score. Have you guys heard of it? No. You know and love it, I'm sure. But the idea of MUSE came out of rapid response teams, is that it is how do you deal with that bucket of patients that are still not being activated. So that's where it came from. Now, the Modified Early Warning Score, when you look through the literature, there's like 100 different Modified Early Warning Scores to pick from. So you're never going to pick the perfect one, because they're never going to fit every single patient. But what it does do is it teaches people to tie in the heart rate, blood pressure, all those things into one number. So slight changes in everything is as bad as a big change in one thing. So posters, if you're at St. Paul's Hospital, we plastered these posters everywhere, and we had phone stickers, and we gave out 2,000 lanyard cards. We don't have that many staff, so I don't know what they did with it. But the motto of call early, call often, and if you're worried, that's reason enough, is plastered everywhere. Documentation. So I don't know if Lionsgate knows, you've lived CST. We're about to do CST in months from now. So when we came up with our documentation, being on paper would have been great, but it wasn't going to help us with the transformation to clinical documentation in a very short period of time. So this is our CCOT contact record, and right now it's a bit of a hybrid. Our team fills it out electronically, saves the copy, and then puts the paper copy in the chart. And there was a reason for that. But essentially, the front page of that documentation is, what's going on, what's the history, what's the initial happening right now, and the back page of that is what am I seeing with this patient? What are their assessments, and what am I doing with this patient, and what's the plan? So it's two pieces of paper, or it's one piece of paper that has a lot of really important information. And what I'm hearing from the teams as I circle back from the different wards is that people see the CCOT form and they're like, oh, what's going on with this patient? So there's a little bit of attentiveness. And also that piece of paper is becoming a source of truth. Like people are going to it because it has a lot of really great information. That's the contact record in a nutshell. Data management plan. So like I said, so this was a big conundrum for our team. Like when the leadership team got together going, oh my God, how are we going to do this? This is what we came up with. So the nurse, the team goes up and sees the patient. Hey. And they carry around a computer and they have the little Dora backpack with them. And they fill out this form on a fillable PDF form. So that's Shirley doing that right there. And then what they're going to do is they're going to print a copy, sign that copy, and put that in the patient chart. So that stays with our lovely paper chart for now, for a very short period of time. Then they're going to save that PDF into a folder on a shared drive that all the CCOT team has access to. That's our active CCOT patient list. At the end of the day, when they hand over to the next team, they're like, these are the patients I've seen, these are the patients I've signed off on, and these are the patients you're going to need to follow up on the next day. And then that team takes that computer and those PDF electronic forms over to see the next patient, and they fill out the next form. And so this is how we have a flow of paper and electronic data going in two different directions. And I have to commend our team. Carrying around the computer and managing the shared drive is a bit clunky. It's not as smooth as paper, but they were very committed to doing that because what it allows us to do is this next part of it. So that active patient list, when they're not active anymore, they get moved over to the inactive patient list. So all the old files get stored into this other folder, which I get to play around with. And I take those fillable PDF forms and I extract them into an Excel spreadsheet and I can make lovely graphs out of it. But I can use those lovely graphs to tell the story of what our CCOT team is doing on week 1, on week 4, on week 8, on week 12. So I have some fairly recent real-time data to report back to our team, but also to report back to the program, say, okay, this is where we are, this is what we're doing right, this is what we're missing, and get that information. And that has been hugely valuable, not only to teach the whole hospital about what CCOT is and does, but also to help us know what we're doing right and how we can react in real time, real-ish time. Then we have a lovely, amazing, wonderful informatics nurse who also takes a look at all those inactive files, and she enters it into the database. So this process of the PDF Excel is really just for the first year of us getting going, just because we wanted to be very nimble and very responsive to what was happening in real time. That's when we go to electronic charting, it's all just going to go into the database, so that electronic charting piece will be gone. So once she enters it into the database, then we delete those files, and they're gone for good. So that's kind of where we are. And what that allows us to do is to tell you what's been going on. I actually have the first 14 weeks of data, but I didn't have time to make pretty graphs. So you're going to get the first 8 weeks of data, which is until April 5th. So, like I said, ICU transfers, we follow up all ICU patients for 48 hours, not necessarily every shift, but usually for 48 hours. And that was something our physician group was doing anyway. So now we're just adding a CCOT team to that piece of it. And that's about 11 visits per week is that. So far for the first 8 weeks, we're hitting our target so we're on average 20 activations per week. And that is, you know, RT nudge and drive-by activation. That's how you do that. Scheduled follow-up. So we follow up a good chunk of our patients. Usually for 2 to 5 visits, there's a handful of patients that we follow up more. But whenever you see a patient, you get that choice, like what's going on right now? Do I need to see them in 6 hours, 12 hours, sooner than that, later, longer than that? And there's also the callback. So we get about 4 or 5 callbacks per week as well. So that's when the patient is actually on our CCOT list. We're planning to come see them in 6 or 12 hours, but something has changed and the ward has called us to come back earlier. That's what that is. And then there's a bucket of other. And I suspect that bucket of other, okay, part of the reason why we have a bucket of others, because we're coming from we didn't come from had nothing and then had CCOT. We came from we had a CRN model that did some of the work that CCOT does, but they also did a lot of mentorship and leadership support. And so we didn't want to take all of that away. We knew that there's going to be a transition period. And there's people that, at 2 o'clock in the morning when the educator's not there and you've never seen a chest tube, well, if that nurse doesn't know how to handle that chest tube, that's going to be a CCOT call eventually. So you might as well just get there earlier and give them the information they need to make the right decision at the time. I suspect that we're under-capturing that because I know our CCOT team, if it's just like a drive-by less than 5 minutes, they don't say anything. But if it's specifically for, I've never done this thing before, then we'll capture it. So we're trying to find out how much time we're spending on those other things. We're on target. I have to say, the last 3 weeks were just below 16, so we're working on that. This is our activity. So in the first 8 weeks, 610 patient visits. So we've been busy from the get-go. And Annie, who was our first CCOT nurse, she has the worst luck, I swear to God. We have seen, that's 189 patients we've seen in the first 8 weeks. For the most part, 1 to 5 visits, but there's a handful of patients that are that chronic, always a little bit tentative that we've actually done like 10, 15, 20 visits on. And this is how we kind of divide amongst the different teams. As you can see, medicine is the largest program at St. Paul's Hospital. They're the largest program, but they also have the most junior staff. So it's not surprising that CRN spent a lot of time on medicine prior to, and it's not surprising that we're spending a good chunk of our time there as well. Also, St. Paul's data, you'll see in a bit, 80% of our patients have a medical demographic. So, you know, they're our buddies. They're like, you know. So activation. So in the first 8 weeks, we've had 155 initial activations, and no surprise, I'm worried about something is the most common reason why we were activated, followed up by respiratory changes. So that's exactly what the world has been telling us with many places around the world. So it's good to know we're on target there. In the first 8 weeks, nobody used Muse as an activation. No one used Muse as the reason why they triggered. At least that's what we've captured. When I circle back to the different teams, I've learned some very interesting things. So Muse actually had, prior to CST, Muse was implemented on the cardiology ward and the medicine wards for about 2 or 3 years. So they've had a history of using Muse. But when it was taught and implemented on those 2 wards, they didn't include their physician group in the implementation. So they implemented it as, this is a nursing tool. So this is a nursing tool to help trigger you to do something different. But when you're on the phone to the MRP, you're not going to say the Muse score is 5 because they won't know what that means. What you're going to say is, I'm worried about this patient because the heart rate's this, the blood pressure's this, da, 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 da. So these nurses have a history of thinking that you don't say Muse when Muse was the trigger. So potentially we could be under capturing it. We'll have to do a little bit more investigation.
So we sort of lobbied around the whole Muse thing for many years, and because we're documenting by hand, it's not electronically calculating your Muse score. The problem that we saw was, well, you would have already been triggered to make you calculate the score, or are they actually calculating it on every patient all the time and looking for change? Because it's actually a calculation, it's an extra step, and so something's going to make me add it up, which should have already been my trigger. So it kind of seems like you're just confirming that you have that problem instead of problem is causing.
Yeah. So I've had the joy of working on the early warning score group for CST, so I've learned a lot about Muse. I've done a lot of reading on that particular topic, and I've talked to a lot of people about it, heard feedback on it. I can tell you so Muse has been implemented in cardiology and medicine, and they've spent like 3 years trying to get people to calculate it, and that's how long it took.
So every patient, every day,
and so they're supposed to be the experts, and then there's the rest of the hospital is just getting on board Muse now, so they're all learning. And I can tell you, cardiology medicine is slightly better, but not by much, at making sure that they actually calculate the Muse score on paper, but they're not by much, and actually calculate it accurately. One of the things that has helped is they've spent the money to buy a colored flow sheet. So it makes it visually easy to calculate. So if you go into the yellow zone, score one, it's yellow, and if you go to the score 2, it's orange. If you go to the score 3, so you can visually calculate it relatively easier because they've switched to that tool. It doesn't fix the problem entirely, but it does make it better.
But like, I mean, doesn't it mean that you're actually adding up your stuff fairly hourly, or every time you do your vital signs, you're having to do an extra calculation?
Yeah.
Like when we talked about that with nurses, it was like, that's not happening.
Yeah.
They were just a flat rate. So we thought when we go electronic and it's not automatically done, and
yeah, the color form does kind of help.
I have to say, if we don't use right here,
no.
If we only use on score, they're not doing vital signs. They're actually doing score every time you do a vital sign. Yeah, and they do it.
There's 2 articles that stick in my mind that really made me go aha. One was okay, somebody looked at Muse scores and nursing skill level and behavior, and they said, okay, so does Muse scores actually change nursing behavior? And what they found was, if you're a junior, if you're new, and it totally made you change your behavior. You tended to, when the Muse score was higher, you tended to be triggered earlier to activate other people and to do more frequent vital signs. But if you were seasoned and you kind of already put the picture together in your head, it didn't actually change your behavior because you were already doing those sorts of things. So the biggest impact Muse scores have is actually on very junior nurses. It doesn't really have an impact on behaviors of nurses who know what they're doing. So there's that to kind of weight in there. The other thing that was really interesting is that in hospitals that had successfully implemented a Muse score, it started to be that if the Muse score was not high, they couldn't get the attention they needed even when they needed to. So there was a little bit, so what we've taught our team is the Muse score is a screening tool, but it fails sometimes. There's people who score really, really high, that's their normal, and there's people who score really, really low, but that's not enough. So I think the Muse score that we're implementing with CST, it also has some situational awareness factors, so you can bypass the low Muse score by saying, I'm worried about something. But that's kind of the things that, really did kind of come out in the literature, which I kind of think we're kind of experiencing when I talk to people before. Any other questions about Muse? Because it's a lovely topic.
I was wondering about the call escalation, the way that we're envisioning implementing Muse systems, same call escalation algorithm that Landscape had said that we have a rapid response. So we've been thinking about how that interfaces, and we've come up with some suggestions. And part of the reason we're doing a trial actually is to see how well our suggestions in relation to the rapid response actually will work. So yeah, I was wondering with Muse on your cardiology ward or Landscape, like what responses are expected from a high user? Like what actions are people expected to take when they get a high user?
Yeah, so we've kind of tried to mirror what is going to be built in CST. The CST does not give people hard and fast, you must do this, but they have a graduated alerting system. So if you score 3, suggest, to recommend, to strongly recommend. So the languaging changes, but you still have that bit of clinical decision making you can go in there. If you score a low Muse score, but you also have situational awareness factors, it'll give you the alert as if you scored 5. And if you have someone who has a high Muse score, but there's always been a high Muse score, you'll get the alert for the first time, but you won't be triggered to do another thing unless they go higher or they go down and then they go back up again. Yeah, Muse is not in ICU. Wearing my other hat. And the early warning group that I'm part of, they are trying to figure out what are the right measures for Muse. What's the right measures? We have some baseline data from Lionsgate, which we're using as sort of like a template. They're right now consulting St. Paul's to say, what baseline data do you have about views prior to CST? So we're kind of gathering that information now. But I think some of the basic stuff are like, is Muse even being filled out properly? Are people doing the situational awareness every single time? Are they, if they score X, are they doing vital signs more frequently? On the CST documentation, you can document what you choose to do based on the alert you get right there. So you can kind of capture those things potentially. But, you know, CST is a big animal. We'll see how that goes. So more to come, and it's a bit of a mess, but Muse scores upon initial contact. I did kind of, the ICU nurses don't do Muse scores. It's really never been designed for critical care nurses. They don't need it. But I can be sneaky. They write down a set of vital signs. Right? So on my electronic data capture, I have an Excel spreadsheet, and all those vital signs are there. They're not in the ICU database, but they are in our CCOT Excel spreadsheet. And so I can auto-calculate an approximation of a Muse score based on what they've documented. And if you look, there's a lot of our Muse scores are relatively low, but there are Muse scores that are like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Some of those patients were DNAR patients, so it made sense. But some of those patients weren't. And I kind of wonder, if your Muse score is 6 or 7, what was happening 8 hours ago when their Muse score could have been lower? So that is so I know that we're being called often enough. I'm wondering if we're being called early enough yet, which is what we expect. What do we do? So on average, CCOT spends about an hour on all initial contacts. So that's, you know, finding the chart is one puzzle, but actually going through the chart, making sense of this patient's history, doing a full and thorough assessment, and if you activated us, it's for a reason, so we probably ended up doing something there. But for the follow-up visits and for the ICU transfers, those are about half an hour. Now, because they're follow-up visits, we already know this patient, we already have a good sense of what's going on, but that's the amount of time that they're spending. Response time, for the most part, we're being pretty fast. So the bulk of the time we're there within 15 minutes. There's been a handful of time where we're just over that 15-minute mark. A lot of the times we're either just over, or there was 2 calls that were happening at the same time, or 2 things happening at the same time. And so our CCOT team, being as innovative as they are, they divided and conquered between the RT and the RN, and sometimes even the MD. Or that patient sounds relatively stable. I'm going to see this patient first, and then I'll get to that one there. So we are monitoring that. We do kind of follow up on the ones that have a bit of a delay, and that's kind of where they've been sitting at so far. Most of the time, the patient's staying on the floor. So just because CCOT was called doesn't necessarily mean they're going to the ICU. 87% of the time, they stay right where they are. But CCOT is always doing something. Like most of the time, we're also doing something. So 58% of the time, we're either making a recommendation or actually doing an intervention on one of their list of interventions they can possibly do. Respiratory and cardiovascular, of course, being the most frequent ones, but that's not a big surprise. And so that's where we are right now. So that's our initial process measures. We're keeping a good track of what's going on. We've got a good flow of data happening. We're feeding that information back to our team, but we're also going around to all the different programs saying, okay, now that you've had CCOT for a few months, what's worked well, what can we do better? And we're planning a survey to find out, okay, what's your impression with your interactions with CCOT? Are we hitting the mark? And then a bit of time, when our data finally gets into the ICU database and back out to us, we're going to be taking a look at our patient outcomes. And the next step. So I was incredibly jealous when I was on the phone with the director of the Ontario Critical Care Services of Ontario, when he told me that you get automatic funding. We have some great programs that are happening in BC. I think we are potentially moving patient outcomes because of it. And I think what I'm learning is data is a really powerful way of moving that message. That's how Ontario got automatic funding, is making a really well-informed, heavily evidence-informed argument to the government. And I think that's probably what we need to do as well. So is there a potential of, you know, all the CCOT teams getting together quarterly to like hash out CCOT stuff? I would love that. But I think there's a potential now that we've got 2 different programs going on in 2 different places that we could leverage our work and make that case for this is how you do it right, and this is how you can change patient outcomes. And if we're doing it, why isn't everyone else doing it as well?
Ensuring all our CCOT calls get into the database so that we are able to pull it the ones who don't end up in the ICU, that's always sort of been our hiccup. How do we capture them because they're not normally in the ICU database? So where's your connection that you make sure the non-admitted patients get to the informatics?
So there is actually two databases. There's the ICU database, and then there's the critical care outreach database. So a lot of the things that are on our contact record are actually being entered into our CCOT, our CCOT database. Currently, right now, I think it's just VGH and ourselves, and Surrey. I don't know if Surrey.
We collect our own internal data.
Yeah.
Rural Columbia and Surrey.
Yeah, I know, and this was quite shocking to me because when we were first planning this CCOT team like 2 years ago, we didn't even know that there was a database for our CCOT data to go into. I didn't know, all the time I was at VGH, I didn't know they had a database that it can flow into, but they had already built this lovely server base, very similar to the ICU database, and I'm sure Steve, you can share a little bit more.
Oh, yeah, what's going on?
I know you're coming.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the BC chapter of the CACCN YouTube channel. We have a lot of great content, both from Handshake BC that's recorded, and we're just in the process of cleaning up and getting it ready for YouTube, but also from previous events we've had over the past 12 months. I would suggest subscribe and hit the notification button so you can know when the next thing is out. And if you ever want to come to our next event, we're on Facebook and on Instagram. Our links are listed below. And while I'm on the topic, if you're a critical care nurse anywhere in Canada, why don't you join CACCN? We have a ton of resources to help you be the best critical care nurse you can be. Go to caccn.ca and join us.